This is Gabriel Custodiet of Watchman Privacy. I know why you're here. You're looking to escape the technocratic apparatuses that you see slowly enveloping you and restraining your freedom. For the fundamentals of privacy, you should start by visiting escapethetechnocracy.com to see my video tutorials, books, and other resources for getting off the surveillance grid. Watchman Privacy and Escape the Technocracy are leading the fight for privacy, and unlike just about any other show, we practice what we preach: private payment options, no threat modeling, no statist or collectivist solutions, and no sponsors, ever. You know what that means? It means we can speak the unmitigated truth as we see it. Your support alone determines the future of this show. Go support you and me at escapethetechnocracy.com. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Peter Boettke. He says I can call him Pete, so I will do so. And Professor Boettke is a distinguished university professor of economics at George Mason University, director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center, also at George Mason University. So, Professor Boettke, Pete, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Great to be here, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
My pleasure. I first encountered Pete through his book, which I think was his dissertation on the first 10 years of the Soviet Union, which I believe was written at the time that the Soviet Union was collapsing. So that's quite interesting. Professor Boettke has written a number of books on free markets, USSR, recently on Poland and Estonia and other countries that are evading the grasp of the Soviet Union so-called planned economy. And I wanted to focus on the Soviet Union in this discussion. Allow me to set the scene real quick. So let's go back to the early 20th century. It's a chilly February in 1917. Vladimir Lenin, who is in his late 40s, he has a lot of dreams of socialism, communism, but never accomplished anything serious in that regard, perhaps. He's traveling by train through Germany. He arrives in Zurich, travels to the Baltic Sea, where he takes a ferry to Sweden, and then he makes his way to Petrograd, where in the upcoming months and years, he will alter human history. So, Pete, this is kind of a really grand economic experiment where finally the communists, the Marxists, have power over a substantial country. And I'm just curious if you could also help us set the scene. Like, what were the first things that these utopians tried to do to completely alter the course of economic policy in the initial years that they were in power?
Well, thank you for that setup. One of the great books is To the Finland Station, about Lenin and whatnot. And Lenin himself was a revolutionary. His brother, was executed because of a plot to assassinate the Tsar. Lenin was radicalized by that. He was trained as a lawyer, but he was all involved in Marxist movements. And he was the head of a faction of the Social Democratic Party in Russia, which was named the Bolsheviks. That included a lot of other revolutionaries that were quite fascinating figures that he marshaled and utilized in various things. And then as the revolution sort of got going after his return, he aligned with Trotsky and was able to pull off the revolution later on as the governments collapsed. So the provisional government could not hold its center, and the economic situation continued to worsen, and they were able to take advantage of that. And in 10 Days It Shook the World, which is a book written by John Reed, who's the only American buried in the Kremlin. John Reed was an American journalist who was of socialist sympathies, and he went to be an eyewitness to history. And he wrote a book called 10 Days It Shook the World. And the way he describes it, when Lenin took the podium after they had succeeded in controlling the situation, Lenin grabbed the podium, looked out to the audience that was wanting to cheer for him, and just said, "Now we will construct socialism," and then walked away. So I will give you the following original proposals that were adopted, and I'm going to give them in November dates. Because there's a difference between the October dates. The October Revolution was actually in our dates, November. So it was in the old Georgian calendar that they have the October dates, but this is in the Western dates. So they wrest power. And so on November 8th, 1917, they formed the People's Commissar. On that same day, so this is the next day after the revolution, the decree on land. They abolished all landlords' rights to private property and confiscated all landed estates. On November 27th, they had a decree that workers control over all production. So workers would now be in charge, no longer bosses or owners, right? On December 15th, they established, this is all still 1917, they established the Supreme Economic Council. On the 27th of December, they nationalized all the banks. In January, now 2018, January 15th, all dividend and interest payments and all dealings in stocks and bonds were declared as illegal. On the 16th, Declaration of the Rights of Working and Exploited People, so the abolition of exploitation of man by man. February of that same year, repudiation of all foreign debt. On April, they nationalized all foreign trade. May 1st, they abolished all inheritance. And, that sort of gives you a start to what they were trying to do. They were following very clearly the Marxian program of trying to abolish private property and the means of production. That was the way that you would move from a kingdom of necessity, a world of scarcity, to a kingdom of freedom. That is a world of post-scarcity because you rationalize production under the central plan. And as a result of that, you would end up by eliminating the class conflicts that had existed throughout the capitalist history. And it was in that plan, and there's a book by Plekhanov and Nikolai Bukharin called The ABCs of Communism, which laid all this out for them to follow. And that was their, that was their model. That was what they were going to try to do.
Well, I'm so glad that they abolished the exploitation of man by man. That had been a long time coming for sure. I'm sure that completely worked. So as time goes on, Lenin would die in 1924. There were a lot of people a lot of Western intellectuals, Bertrand Russell, H.G. Wells, who were looking at the early Soviet Union in the early 10 or 20 or 30 years. And in their view, there was a lot to be excited about. And maybe, I don't know exactly, maybe there were signs of some kind of success in certain regards. I wonder if you could explain why these people found it, were enthusiastic about it, and what the reality was on the ground, and if there were certain things like that made, for example, the early Soviet Union maybe more immune to the Great Depression than some of the traditionally capitalistic countries.
So let me start out with a piece of fiction, which is George Orwell's Animal Farm. So not 1984, but Animal Farm, which is his attempt to have a allegory to what was going on in the Soviet context. So the various different characters represent Soviet figures, okay? And so Old Major is Marxist-Leninism, Napoleon is Stalin, Snowball is Trotsky, and Boxer, who's the faithful horse, that's Nikolai Bukharin. And there's a scene in the book where Orwell's telling the story, and he says the following thing. He says, to the outside world, the farm looked more prosperous and thriving than ever before. But inside, the animals ate less and worked harder than they ever did before. And this contrast between the picture that was painted outside and the reality of life on the ground is a very important aspect, which took a long time for Western intellectuals to wrap their heads around, because this was their dream aspiration. Okay. And so just a little bit of facts here on economics, which is that the period which became to be known as war communism, but at the time was just called communism, that's between 1917 and 1921. They had a 70% decline in industrial output. That's a depression far greater than the Great Depression. What this forced them to do was adjust their economic policies. And between 1921 in 1928, they followed a set of policies called the New Economic Policy, which was to allow the introduction once again of markets. They allowed markets, and they were controlled. The phrase "commanding heights" comes from that period. They decided to maintain the commanding heights, But what they did do is they allowed for small scale trading, a lot of things, especially in agriculture and other places, which allowed them to muddle through for a while. That's during this whole period that you were talking about, where Lenin has his stroke and then is incapacitated, but yet hasn't quite died. He's trying to find the next successor, and there becomes a battle of power between between Trotsky, Stalin, and Nikolai Bukharin. And so Trotsky gets defeated first because Stalin and Bukharin align to defeat the extreme left, version. Trotsky goes off into exile. And then right at that point, Stalin then switches and gets rid of Bukharin. And so then Bukharin is exiled, and then eventually, as same with Trotsky, assassinated. Bukharin's not assassinated. He's actually tried and executed. So he comes back after he's safely in Paris, but he comes back and is executed in a trial. Trotsky, as you know, was assassinated in Mexico. So what happened was between 24 and 28, the economy is going through this new economic policy. It's muddling along. By 28, they introduced a new what's now called the 5-year plans, the first of the 5-year plans. And they engage in what's involved in what's called an industrialization debate. Now, why is it that intellectuals later on thought that they had achieved much? Well, one, when Lenin came to power in 1917, the Soviet Russia was still largely a peasant economy. Because of the industrialization by the government, the system had shifted to now a more industrialized economy. So away from agriculture to industrial economy. The second thing is that that industrial economy was militarized. Okay, so they ended up by having a military economy that was able to then be able to fight the Nazis. Now, it's important to remember is that originally Stalin and Hitler were allies, and they had a pact that they signed among each other in 1938, in which they were annexing various parts of Europe to one another. Those are the Nazi parts, these are the Soviet parts, and all these things like that. And then what happened was that agreement broke down. Hitler moved against Stalin, and eventually then Stalin ended up by being an ally with the Western UK and the United States to defeat the Nazis. And they were able to have the military might to aid in that process of doing that. And so this is a miracle, right? To go from a peasant economy to an advanced industrial economy in less than 20 years. And so Western intellectuals thought, well, if you could do it during wartime, you could do it during peacetime. And wouldn't that be a wonderful model? And so post-World War II, the West, both the West and the Soviets, exported basically versions of central planning to the less developed world, during that whole period. And eventually this was revealed itself to be a massive mistake. But it took a long time for people to do that. I'll say one last thing on this, which is that Sidney and Beatrice Webb, when they did their report on the Soviet Union, they actually called it a new civilization, ? And they meant it in a very real sense, that this is like the new way of doing things, the new good way of doing things. We've now moved forward because, again, we're abolishing the exploitation of man by man. We're going to rationalize production, and we're going to achieve all the things that you can achieve under a capitalist system, because capitalism suffers from macroeconomic instability as evidenced by the Great Depression, and microeconomic inefficiency as evidenced by concentrations of capital in the hands of a few, monopoly power.
And so it's hard to imagine this, and fortunately we don't have to imagine because somebody tested it out. How exactly does an economy work with no stock market, no credit is my understanding, like no banks? How exactly did they try to make that work?
Well, it doesn't work. This is the key. This is the very important thing to get across to everyone. It just simply doesn't work. It doesn't have the incentives. It doesn't have the requisite information and knowledge. This is a critical idea, and let me go back in time a little bit. When Lenin was in exile, he still was the party leader. Okay. And he would direct people to go and study various different issues because they were an intellectual movement. Lenin himself, had to write a book on the development of capitalism in Russia to try to show that despite the fact that Russia was largely a agricultural economy, a peasant economy, it had enough industrialization already under the czars to qualify as a capitalist economy. Therefore, it was ripe for revolution. Right, because if in the stages of Marxism, you need to be at that stage of capitalism in order to then move to the next stage, because it's the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's a dialectical method, and this is a very Lenin was a very talented writer, thinker, and all these things like that. It's not like convoluted. It's not like when you read Stalin's, writings later on. He was not intellectual. Okay. But Lenin was very much, an intellectual, knew how to argue, things like that. And he wanted other people around him who were like that. And he put people on assignments. Okay. So he sent, Nikolai Bukharin, who was the theoretician of the party. He sent him to Austria to study Austrian economics, because Austrian economics was considered to be the most coherent set of ideas critical of Marxism. The leading Austrian economist at the time was a man named Eugen von Bavarick. He was a finance minister of Austria, but he also was a professor at the University of Vienna. And he was a professor of Ludwig von Mises. He's the professor of Joseph Schumpeter. And he was the professor of Nikolai Bukharin. Nikolai Bukharin sat in his classes and ended up by writing a book critical of the Austrian school. Now, why am I telling you all this is because Bukharin was the architect of, as I mentioned before, he wrote this book called The ABCs of Communism, and he was the architect of the original doctrines and policies that were introduced between 1917 and 1921. But he also is the architect of the policies when they decided to switch towards more markets. And when he does that in his famous speech on this, he mentions Ludwig von Mises, the great Austrian economist. And he said, Mises is right that at this particular moment, we cannot engage in rational economic planning, rational centralized economic planning. But Mises will have the last laugh, because eventually we'll learn how to do it and then we'll overcome Mises. But at the moment, Mises is right. And he says the peasants must learn to enrich themselves. And this is what gets him in trouble when Stalin flips from attacking Trotsky, left-wing childness, and right-wing deviationism, right? This is the way the party operated. And so he first purges the left-wing childness, that's Trotsky. And then what happens is he eventually purges Bukharin because of right-wing deviationism. And but the evidence that they use is the fact that he's, citing Mises and whatnot like that. So that's a pretty important factor in all of this. The reason why Mises is called, and this is Bukharin's exact words, the most learned critic of communism, Ludwig von Mises, is because Mises is the author of this very important argument called the problem of economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. And what Mises demonstrates in there is a logical syllogism. Without private property and the means of production, there would be no exchange for the means of production. Without exchange for the means of production, there would be no relative prices established for the means of production. Without relative prices, there is no way for the economic actors to decide how to allocate scarce resources among the competing ends. That is, engage in rational economic calculation. Rather than, the goal of rationalized production would that you produce more with less. Produce more with less resources. That way you continue to have wealth creation. If you can't engage in that, you end up by having wealth destroying activity, because you end up by producing less, utilizing more resources. And that throughout the history of the Soviet Union was a very common factor, that they suffered incentive problems and they suffered this problem of economic calculation. So they couldn't plan the economy in any kind of rational way to deliver the goods and services to their citizens. And so that's the reason why when we look at the economic growth statistics, we have to dig underneath of them rather than just look at the aggregate numbers of government expenditures on X, Y, and Z, and instead look at the actual consumer life of the individuals within the economy, which was always struggling. Just to move forward in time, this is a major part of the debate, that took place in the famous kitchen debate with Khrushchev and Nixon, all those years later on, when Khrushchev took his shoe at the UN and banged it against the podium. What Khrushchev meant by that was not that we will bury you militarily, but that we'll bury you, with our economic output. And that, of course, doesn't take place. So, yeah.
Very bizarre experiment in human history. I think also there was a mandate that prices could not rise at all. And so, of course, you get all kinds of shortages and other things.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the key things to always remember about post-Soviet reforms is that these were all shortage economies, right? That was the issue. They were all shortage economies. And what that meant was that the posted official price is not the price that they could command the goods for. So the only way they could command the goods is to pay the bribe price or the black market price. And so that sets up everything to understand the glue of how you asked me earlier, how did this system actually operate? It operates in this very sort of what used to be called a Rube Goldberg kind of, method, which is a kind of ins and outs of a hodgepodge of activities. And so the black market, extra planning, the idea that you had an agent in the Soviet planning system called the Tokachi, and the Tokachi would be this middleman who would try to fix the supply shortages and whatnot within the planning system itself. And so the system is fascinating to study because it has nothing to do with the textbook model of central planning. It has everything to do with the sort of hodgepodge kind of arrangements that emerged to try to just stumble through.
I thought I could just go off on a little bit of a deviation here. Something I found really interesting when reading about the Soviet Union. And according to what I found in the 1960s, you had the Soviet Union, 40% of the chemistry PhDs were attained by women, whereas in the US it was 5%. And so my understanding is that the Soviet Union had a huge removal of the roles of the sexes. And of course, that has various social consequences. But I'm just curious how much of a role those sorts of things played in the economics of the Soviet Union, as far as you're aware, the removal of the sex roles.
Well, that was a major goal early on of socialism was equal rights. This had to do with things having to do with birth control and all kinds of other areas in life. A lot, not only reproductive freedom, but also abolishing the marriage contract and the subjugation of women to their husbands and all of this. So that's a major part of their early agenda. It also becomes a kind of a strange thing for them because they have a decline in birth rates. And so then what they did was they tried to have policies which would reward having more kids. So I have a student, Clara Piano, who teaches at the University of Mississippi. She's written a lot of essays on this waffling in Soviet family policy, which is quite fascinating for listeners if they want to look it up. It's again, Clara Piano at University of Mississippi Economics Department. Anyway, there's a great movie art sometimes because we're dealing with a samizdat culture. That is, the official view is different from the real view. What was called at the time living the lie, right? You had to live the lie. There's a book called Moscow Doesn't Believe in Tears, a movie. And it's a female engineer. She's in Moscow. Her husband is a former hockey player who's now become an alcoholic. And so their life is kind of a mess. And it just sort of goes through her various different daily struggles that she faced in living in Moscow, even though she's an engineer, right? Kind of thing. And so, yeah, there's no doubt that if you go look at Soviet art, the kind of propaganda art that they used, they very much want to have equality of the sexes, and they want to promote that idea, and that's something that they really tried to push in their policies and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, just another kind of bizarre thing. I also saw a statistic that the average Soviet Union woman had something like 10 abortions throughout her life. So very, very odd situation.
Yeah, so they didn't have availability of birth control, nor did they have the availability of a lot of female sanitary conditions. Okay. And so this is a major thing that got revealed during the post Soviet period in these various different places. The ability to now import a lot of Soviet, feminine hygiene products and stuff, which they didn't have before. The figure of the abortions, there's a great book by Francine Gray called Walking the Tightrope, which is about what life was like for females in the Soviet system. A little interesting story about that is that so she's one of the people that number that you just mentioned comes from, on the number of abortions. Milton Friedman, I was at a luncheon with Milton Friedman 30 years ago now, and this number came up, and he disputed it because he just thought that wasn't, a reasonable figure. Like you can't imagine that would be true. And because of the issues having to do with, getting pregnant, all these other things. So, you understand that if, it's just a huge number of pregnancies that have to be terminated within the period of time within which women are fertile. It's the best data that we have, but again, I think we probably need to, always be highly suspicious of both the original statement of the data and our efforts to recalculate the data, because we are doing our best judgments rather than the idea that we have high quality data to work with.
Of course, in the West, we're familiar with the idea of the military-industrial complex, where you have this pretty nasty relationship sometimes with the government and the so-called defense companies. Was there something similar in the USSR? Obviously, not private companies, but powerful lobbies within the country that insisted that that war should continue for their benefit.
Yes, 100%. It was a militarized economy. And so even sewing machines, for example, were produced within, the defense sector. There's a fantastic book called The Price of the Past by Clifford Gaddy, Gaddy, and he is at the Brookings Institute, and he really dug into like the issue of, what the Soviet system was like and how its legacy has continued in the post-Soviet period related to these very issues that you're just raising here, which is the militarization of the Soviet economy. That is the key thing to keep in mind, is that the Soviet Union, in order to survive, was a militarized economy. It was not a consumer-oriented economy. It was not a social goals-oriented policy. It was purely a military economy.
If there's anything, I mean, obviously, we don't want to try this experiment again on humanity, but one of the interesting things perhaps that arose out of it is that there were certain statistics in this top-down economy, right? This top-down society. You have all these statistics, people are controlled, there's a lot of central planning. I discovered recently that there was apparently a 1977 study on a flu epidemic in Russia that had a ton of data, because they knew who was going into cities, who was leaving. They just had all of this kind of centralized data. And I'm just curious if there were other interesting statistics that came out of a highly centralized place like this.
Well, you mean for surveillance capitalism kind of thing, and the surveillance military state? Yeah, I mean, obviously they, first of all, because of the problem of economic calculation, they did not have the kind of innovation that you saw in the West. So a large part, there's lots of books that have been written on this. A large part of their technological development was from espionage of Western technologies. which is they would steal technologies from the West, and then they would reverse engineer it back home, right? And so there's very little things that they did that we didn't do, but they might have perfected them, right, in doing it. So think about like the use of psychiatric wards to discipline its population. It's not like we didn't do that, right, in the United States, but they did it, with extreme version of it in the Soviet Union. And so it's important to I've been talking a lot about the economics, but bringing up the psychiatric hospitals actually brings up an important component that we have to always remember, is that the Soviet Union is responsible for anywhere between 10 million to more deaths. A very conservative estimate would be somewhere about 10 to 20 million deaths that are not due to war and not due to just an aging like sickness but by forced extermination of its population, right? Like a bullet to the back of the head. If we add up the socialist experiments, the communist experiments of the 20th century, that number gets close to 100 million. You think about like Pol Pot, Mao, various different other, regimes. But just, the Soviet Union alone, this is a record of death and destruction. It's not anything for anyone to look at and say, oh, wow, they achieved X, Y, and Z, because again, like to the outside world, per capita income was going up, right? So they look at the world during the Stalinist 5-year plans and they're like, oh, look, per capita income is going up. But per capita income was going up because you were cutting the denominator, right? And there's nothing, that is celebratory about that. This was a regime of mass murder and of economic deprivation. And so, one of the most important things to communicate to people is the full extent of the horror of this experiment, because it's not that, oh, if only we had good people in charge, or only if we would have tried harder. They had, especially, the beginning revolutionaries, sincere, desire to try to, make society better than what it currently was. And it led to a disaster, because it's just a wrong way to think about how we live better together.
And on that topic, in the late 19th century, the West discovered Mendelian genetics, right, by the monk Gregor Mendel. We start to understand how genetics work. Is it true that a certain Russian scientist, through his rejection of this common sense science, may have led to the death of as many as 50 million people?
Well, I don't know the exact estimate of that, but the issue is that Lysenkoism was given like free rein, and it was to overturn Western science. So let me back up a second. One of the really fascinating characters in the philosophy of science in the 20th century was a physical chemist named Michael Polanyi. Michael Polanyi was the head of physical chemistry at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And he was very good friends with Albert Einstein, who was also at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. And then, of course, you have the rise of Hitler. And so they all have to leave and go elsewhere. But at the same time that you have the Nazis causing problems, you also have the Soviets causing problems in science. Polanyi's historical background is that he was born in Hungary and then raised in Vienna, and then migrates to Berlin to pursue his science. And so he has friends that are in the Soviet context, scientific friends. They're not able to practice science anymore and so Polanyi moves away from being a physical chemist to a practitioner of philosophy of science, because he's obsessed with the idea of what science in a free society must look like. Having open inquiry, all these kind of issues that are involved in science in a free society. And one of the most, devastating examples of the Soviet control of science was Lysenkoism and the substitution for standard views of biological evolution by this. So yeah.
According to what I'm reading here, may have been responsible also for the Chinese famine of 1959. These sorts of ideas.
The ideas of Marx and Lenin, Mao, these individuals are just devastating for humanity. And they are philosophies of death and destruction rather than of uplifting and deliverance, which is how they were sold to everyone. And if you think about it and just go in the various different, experiments across the board, from Castro in Cuba all the way up to more recently in Venezuela, it's this same model of death and destruction that follows in its wake, not any kind of romantic notion of solidarity and improvement in the well-being of the least advantaged and most vulnerable among us. That socialism doesn't deliver on its promise.
Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht are obliterating the Russians early on. The U.S. would start to help Russia in its war efforts, and I read some statistics that they would give them a ton of resources throughout their pushing back of the German army. Is it possible that the U.S., though, considering what we've discussed, may have been fighting on the wrong side in World War II?
I don't think they fought on the wrong side. I do think that they created. I mean, Hitler is and fascism is just another variant of socialism. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Remember, Hitler's party was the National Socialist Party. And Stalin's party it started out as an international socialist party. That's under Lenin. But under Stalin, it became socialism in one country. All right. So just think about those terms, socialism in one country and national socialism. I think it would be hard to distinguish between which one is which. This is why, again, in Animal Farm, you have this situation where at the end, the animals look in the pig and man and pig, and they both look the same, right? So, so I don't think they fought on the wrong side. I do think that having the Soviets as allies, that we provided them with a tremendous amount of resources, including technological resources, that they were able to sustain their system with, in a way that if they were left to their own devices, the system probably would have collapsed a lot earlier.
I wonder if you could explain why von Mises was such an important figure.
Well, I think that he's the greatest economist that has ever lived. And the reason for that is because of the series of innovations of economics that he brought into the literature, the professional literature of the science of economics. And the first of those is his contributions to our understanding of the monetary economy. So he was the first economist to take the ideas that had been developed in the marginalist revolution, the transformation from classical economics to neoclassical economics, and apply them to the field of money. And it's in a book called The Theory of Money and Credit. And that book is not only an outstanding discussion of how monetary units emerge in a society without the need of the state, but also how it is the mechanism by which they cannot be imposed by the state. Like the government can't just say tomorrow will be ashtrays and, we'll be able to do that. And it's in the context of that Mises developed his wonderful ideas about the manipulation of money and credit by a central bank. And that led to his theory of the business cycle. So the cyclical volatility that we witness in the market is not due to the inherent speculation of capitalists, but due to the central bank manipulating money and credit such that they stimulate the economy by lowering interest rates in one period. And then what happens is that in order for that boom to continue, you would have to stimulate at ever faster rates, which means that you threaten to face with hyperinflation. And so when the government turns the spigot off, the economy has to adjust backwards to the real underlying savings and consumption trade-offs. And so you get a boom and bust cycle. And Mises was really the first person to really explain that and work out the details of that in relationship to the nature of the price system. So right off the bat, just that book alone, which he wrote as a youngster, that is a major contribution and set him up. But right on the heels of that, Mises wrote this stuff about his work on socialism, showing that the socialist economy could not operate as it had been promised to operate. And so he shows not only does the government cause the distortions in the macroeconomy within a market economy, efforts to abolish a market economy and substitute central planning are not going to be able to achieve its results. After those two contributions, then Mises also addresses the issue about why it is that economists, as it is evolving in the early decades of the 20th century, was unable to understand these 2 points. Why didn't other economists see the same thing Mises saw as it matched to the reality of the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century? And that's a methodological argument. Economists had become too aggregative, focusing away from the choices of individuals, but instead on macroeconomic variables. They had which means that they're not talking about the price system. They're talking instead about these independent, things like the unemployment or the levels of investment. And they, did have investment that wasn't tied to the interest rate and all of these issues. And in addition to that, mathematics, which economists had become increasingly trying to use as their form of proof, demonstrative proofs in their theories, that form of formalism ended up by masking the nuances of us human beings living in a world of uncertainty and figuring out ways to cope with our ignorance and all of this. And so Mises's methodological writings then emerged. So you have his macro writings, his work on the problems of socialist calculation, and then his work on the uniqueness of the human sciences and the methodology that's associated with a world as if matter could talk, right? And so we're going to be a science, but we're a science in which the actors in which we are studying have free will and engage in their own decisions about where to go. And we need to understand the systematic incentives that they face, the knowledge processing that they engage in, and the adaptations and adjustments that are required in order to coordinate economic activity through time. And so those are Mises's 3 major contributions before he even leaves Vienna. Then what happens is he leaves Vienna and he goes to teach in Switzerland. And while he's teaching in Switzerland, he produces his book, which combines all of these ideas together. It's the German edition of what came to be known as his book, Human Action, which is a treatise on economics. It didn't have wide circulation during the war because it was during the war years. It was in German. And when he migrates to the United States, he works at the NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research. He publishes his book on bureaucracy and another book on omnipotent government with Yale University Press. And then Yale eventually publishes his book, Human Action, in 1949. And it now sets up the great resistance to both socialism and to the emerging new economics of Keynes. And so Mises is the opposition to those two developments, the arguments for socialism, as well as the arguments for interventionism that are embedded in the new economics of Keynes. And so Mises then now, this combined set of these ideas now become this architectonic system, which is to counter the sort of standard way in which economics had started to evolve in the immediate post-war era. And and then his student Hayek worked on refinements of that system and made major contributions in working on the refinements of that. And so those are the 2 major thinkers of the post-World War II period that then make possible the developments of a variety of other people who were eventually able to overturn a lot of the teaching in economics that had existed from 1950 to 1980.
As an economist and a very informed economist, I'm sure you see all of the ways in which the title of economist is used to intervene in economists in all kinds of terrible, nefarious ways. And so this might seem like a little bit of a low blow question, but one thing I've noticed is that as soon as people try to comprehend and understand some aspect of life, immediately what follows is that they want to alter that. So it's, we understand Mendelian genetics, and almost as soon as Francis Galton reads about that, he pulls out a napkin and he writes eugenia on it, and he comes up with eugenics. I wonder if, of course, we can imagine Marx, economics. Here's my point: economics in its study is more of a modern phenomenon, and I just wonder, right? Marx, he's an economist, and he comes up with the line, right? We've tried to understand things so far. The goal, however, is to change things. Is there an argument that the field of economics itself is maybe a problem?
First off, I think you have to think about what science is and what why it strikes our imagination. So Adam Smith had thought about this. He wrote a book called, a collection of his lectures. Lectures on astronomy are collected by his students, and in that he describes the nature of how science progresses. He says it goes from wonder to surprise to appreciation. So we wonder at this, when we look up in the sky. We are surprised when we study celestial mechanics and we find out that there's universal laws that govern the motion of the planets. And then we come to appreciate those, forces at work in nature. Well, a similar thing happens with economics. So Smith, in his great book, he starts the very first words are the greatest improvement to mankind is due to the expansion and division of labor. Okay. So then, as an example, he lays out like what's required for us to be able to produce a common woolen coat that ends up on the back of the day laborer. And then he goes and marches through all the exchanges that are required and the specialization in production and the skills and the production of tools that are used in these various different arts. And it's the number of equations in the exchanges are far in excess of any of our imagination. None of us could make a common woolen coat on our own. All right. And so think about that. That's first of all, we're going to now have the mystery of the mundane. So rather than looking at the planets in the sky, I'm looking at a common woolen coat on the back of a day laborer. And I'm going to now wonder about it. How did that end up there? And then I'm going to study the various ways in which I learn how that common woolen coat ended up there. And I am surprised that it's because of the marshaling of the self-interest of individuals throughout the economy to engage in productive specialization and social cooperation through exchange. And then because I've now been surprised by it and I learn about that governing dynamics, I then develop an appreciation for it. Now, what haven't I done in all of that? I haven't invented the common woolen coat. The common woolen coat already exists, just like the butcher, the baker, and the brewer already provide our dinner.
Right.
What Smith thought economics was about was a philosophical reflection on how the hell the dinner got there. Okay, now fast forward all the way from Adam Smith to F.A. Hayek, who is the modern Adam Smith, all right, of the 20th century, because he's the one who worked the most on the questions of the invisible hand, or what became known as spontaneous order. And Hayek is given the Nobel Prize in 1974. And he gets up there, and the first thing he has to do is give a toast. And he says, well, if I had been asked whether or not economics should be given a Nobel Prize, I would have said no, because no economist should be given this kind of public recognition. Okay? So then the next day, he has to give his lecture. In his lecture, he starts out, the very first paragraph is, we economists have nothing to be proud of. We have made a mess of things, right? Now, it's 1974. This is right in the middle of all the problems of worldwide stagflation, high levels of unemployment, high levels of inflation, which wasn't supposed to be possible under Keynesianism. But yet that was what we were experiencing in our daily life. So we have nothing to be proud of. We've made a mess of things. Why did we make a mess of things? Because we followed the wrong theory, Keynesianism. Why did we follow the wrong theory? We followed the wrong theory because we practiced the wrong philosophy of science. We thought that we could have a science of control. And instead, what we need to do is practice economics as a science of understanding, not a science of control. All right. And then he goes further. I'm not putting words in Hayek's mouth. He says, unless we fix this problem, economics as a science is going to border on charlatanism, because we're going to keep promising people that we can achieve things which we cannot as a science achieve, namely the planning and control of the economy and the environment. So if we continue as charlatans, we are going to turn ourselves into tyrants over our fellow citizens and destroyers of the very civilization of which we benefit. Thank you very much. I appreciate the honor that you just gave me. All right. So it is one of the most bold and damning Nobel lectures in the history of the Nobel Prize in economics. There's been others that have been critical of the practice of economics as well, but Hayek sets a pretty high standard there. And the question is he right? So we economists have tremendous amounts of rents. That is special status, right, in society. There's a council of economic advisors. There's not a council of philosophical advisors, right? We get hired to be consultants, with businesses. We get, paid more than many other professors in the social sciences, precisely because we're viewed as having more market alternatives outside. And yet economics is really a branch of philosophy. If I go back to Adam Smith all the way up to F.A. Hayek, we are practitioners of the moral sciences. We're not practitioners of engineering science. We provide a science of understanding and social criticism, not of social control and planning and engineering. And so, yes, the false belief that we can be engineers and control the economic system is very damaging. We should be disabused of that, our fatal conceit. Hayek's last book, The Fatal Conceit.
That would be a great place to end, although I do have one more question about your recent work. So maybe as a final question, you could try to sum up maybe some of your work in this conversation by talking about how your recent focus on Poland and Estonia, two post-Soviet, I guess, if you want to call them that, countries, have been developing quite considerably decades after the fall of the Soviet Union. What do you see happening in those places? Why are they so special?
Okay, so let me first start by pointing out this is on part of a project that the Fraser Institute in Canada engaged in called The Realities of Socialism. I would recommend all of your listeners to go check it out. Just type in Realities of Socialism. Use Poland to start. One of the things is to look at Balcerovich reforms. Basically, we kind of do in very commonsensical version what's called an economics and event study. So you look at the trend lines in the economy, and then you divide it with an event, right? So period A is before the event. Period B is after the event. You have a defining point when the event happened. In this case, the Balcerovich reforms, Les Balcerovich, which were about stabilization, privatization, these kind of things that happened in the economy. He was the finance minister in Poland after the fall of communism, and he's counted as the shock therapy guy, right? So you put that in there, and then you look at the trend line for per capita income and where it was, and then you follow the trend line out as if there was no event, and then you compare it with what's happened because of the event, right? And you see this amazing improvement in the life of average Poles. And in terms of life expectancy, in terms of per capita income, in terms of their ability to have different commodities in their consumption bundle that they previously didn't have, and whatnot. And so we do that in the Polish one, and there's very good infographics at the website, so young students can see it very easily. These diagram, these consequences. Just to put it in perspective, Poland is on the verge of surpassing the United Kingdom in per capita income. Just let that sink in a little bit. All right. Now in Estonia is an amazing story. And let me just back up on Poland. The other thing about Poland and Estonia is that these two countries suffered tremendously under the intramural battle between Nazism and Stalinism. They were like political footballs pulled in both directions at different times. And so their ability to the tragedy. So if you look at the Canton Forest massacre, that's in Poland. It's one of the really horrible episodes of mass murder that took place under this regime, and of course the scars of that and the are very big. Estonia, very similar. I mentioned earlier the Stalin-Hitler pact. Estonia was one of the countries that became part of the Soviet Union because that was part of this illegal pact to divide up Europe in the way that they did. But what we do in that one is we compare again Estonia under Mart Laar also engaged in a shock therapy, what Mart Laar called "just do it" approach. Now, Estonia is a very small country, so that's important to let everyone know. It's a small country. It's one of the freest countries in the world today, both in terms of social freedoms and economic freedoms. So it's an ideal. It's one of the most modern governments in terms of electronic use in government, voting and things like that. So it's a model to look at. One of the most amazing episodes in Estonia was the cultural reaction against the Soviets, which was called the Singing Revolution. After 1987, when the gap understanding of the failure, right, of the Soviet pact between Hitler and Stalin, the illegitimacy of that pact, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, they wanted to go free, and they used to have this cultural festival in the summers, and that was to Russification. A big part of the Soviet policies in Estonia was to Russify the Estonians. What they did was at this singing revolution is they sang their songs in Estonian, and they sang traditional folk Estonian songs as a rebellion against the Soviet authorities. And this was a peaceful revolution. It caught on, and it just grew and grew and grew, and it led to this sort of change of challenge to the legitimacy of the Soviet occupation. And eventually they were granted their independence. And so Mart Laar comes in, and Mart Laar puts forth radical free market reforms. And now the empirics on this is as follows. If you go back to the early part of the 20th century, Estonia is wealthier than Finland. So the Estonians are doing better than the Finns, let's say in 1925. Communism comes in. The Finns' trend line keeps going up. The Estonian trend line goes down. That's going down in not only issues like per capita income, but also life expectancy and other kind of areas, access to healthcare, all these things like that. So what happens is that the Finns take off on a different direction. The Estonians go in the opposite direction. Now you get Mart Laar and you see a closing of the gap right away. And so it's an amazing story again about how introducing freedom, allowing ordinary individuals to have the freedom to try ideas out, ends up by doing extraordinary things. Whereas when you gave extraordinary power to individuals to control the lives of others, you produced extremely deleterious effects. And so both of these books tell that story in as clear a language as we can, so that audiences of today, young people today, could learn from them.
Hey, thanks for listening. Look, I could use your help real quick. If you could share this, engage with me in some way, leave a review anywhere. This really helps me to break the technocratic shadow banning that is happening with my brand. And of course, if you really want to escape the technocracy, go to escapethetechnocracy.com. Privacy tutorial series, books, consulting, and of course, you can leave a donation. Thank you very much.